A couple of months ago, I received an email from Derek Morris. I had no idea who he was, but he was offering to send me a copy of his brand new book, which was on the Commodore 64. And it's a book about programming and how to develop for the Commodore 64. On the back of the book, it kind of shows who Derek Morris is. Derek Morris is a developer with 2 decades of industry experience. He has a master's degree in computer graphics and has held engine and graphics programming positions at Codemasters, Natural Motion, Sega, and WayForward Technologies. And on the back of the book, it says, learn to develop your own games for the biggest selling home computer of all time, the Commodore 64. Using modern tools, this introductory book guides you through all the elements required to make 2 mini-games, a space shooter and a platformer, and run them on an emulator or real Commodore 64 hardware. Whether you're a retro enthusiast after a nostalgia fix or a newcomer hoping to break into the games industry, this will unleash your creativity. The book is broken into 2 halves. The first half roughly covers building a miniature space shooter, kind of like Space Invaders, but not exactly. But you shoot little aliens, and you have a little spaceship at the bottom, and he fires and shoots at the aliens, and they shoot back at him. And then the second half of the book, and so this is the first game, and in the second half of the book, you develop a little platformer where you jump around on top of objects, and you have to avoid enemies, and you have to worry about scrolling the screen, and you have collision and stuff to worry about. So, being that this is a really short book, the benefit that you have of reading this and going through it is that the source code is available through retrogamedev.com. And that link is right here, retrogamedev.com. And it's all done in the CBM Prg Studio by Arthur Jordison. So all of if you're familiar with the cross-assembler, or even if you're not, this book describes how to configure your emulator, how to configure CBM Prg Studio to run through this book. And each of the chapters where there's programming involved, each chapter is split out. He has a separate folder for each chapter in the download. And so I'm going to run through that just to show you. And then the source code is not very, let's see, how do I put this? The source code is not extremely easy to understand. So you need a book like this to sort of break it down. But what the beauty of it is, if you follow the book and if you look play around with the exercises, there's little tips and things like you could try playing around with these variables, or try changing the color, or uncomment the timer lines to highlight where the code runs. So you can play around with the source code and see what happens. And then all with this book in your back pocket to guide you through. I believe this book is geared towards the beginning programmers as well as the intermediate. Depending upon how advanced you are, you may or may not be geared toward that audience. It might be a little too basic. It starts off, the first few chapters, describing essentially what is binary, what is hexadecimal, and then it starts to talk about the Commodore 64 hardware, the 6502 chip, the VIC chip, which is the graphics chip, interface chip, the SID chip, which is the music chip, the memory, the memory layout of the Commodore 64, and then it goes into the instruction sets for assembly language on the Commodore 64, and it describes like why would you dive right into assembly language? Why wouldn't you just use BASIC or another programming language? Well, with BASIC, it's just too slow to do most programs. Most games need something faster, and it describes that in the book. And then it talks about the instructions and how the addressing works on the Commodore 64, how indexing works. In Chapter 4, you learn all about what an integrated development environment is, and that's when you're introduced to the CBM Prg Studio by Arthur Jordison. And so he has a download link for that. And then he shows you how to set up and configure CBM Prg Studio to use his program samples and also the how to configure the emulator. He shows how to set up the debugger to debug a small program. Set up the emulator. Talks about macros versus subroutines. So at the very beginning of the book is just kind of setting things up. And then when you get to part 3 on page 37, and that's when we start building a little space shooter. And so rather than me going page by page through the book, I think it would be fun to go ahead at this point and look at what's included in the download at retrogamedev.com. The source code is broken into chapters, so each chapter has its own folder, and if you don't really understand what's going on, you can revert back to the book for that chapter. And then just dig into the code and start playing around with variables and things. Let's go ahead and take a look at the source code. Alright, so here I am over on the retrogamedev.com website, and what you want to do is go to this link over here on the left, the Retro Game Dev, and check out that there's a couple more books coming out. One that says Advanced Edition coming soon, and then another for the NES coming soon. So that's interesting. Well, you click here and then learn a little bit about the book. But what you want to do is download the source, and that's up here on the right. In order to do that, you have to log in. You just got to put in your email or in your password, and you can sign up and download that source. And then once you get it, you will switch over to, and we'll go to Arthur Jordison's website. Over at ajordison.co.uk, go to the download link, and you can download the latest version, which currently is 3.11. And just download that and install it. I've already installed the CBM Prg Studio, and I'm going to go over to the Retro Game Dev folder, and you can see it's broken into the chapters, and that's where I'm going to focus my time. And it starts off in chapter 6, and let me see which page is that on the book. Oh, here it is. So chapter 6 is about the code framework and how the program should be organized. And let's open up that chapter. He already has the program's project file saved, so we can click and go straight in. And we can look directly at the source code. So let's take a look. And let's take a look at a few of these. You can see the variables. Looks like math, subroutines. And then in order to run these, the way you run these are separate assembler programs that are assembled into one program. So you hit Control plus F5 to run. Or you can go up here and do build program and run. Okay, so that's right. In this program, all it does is clears the screen with letter A and puts the letter A everywhere on the screen. And on page 34, it describes the source code for that. Sets the background colors, puts the letter A. It says try changing the character and color. So let's put the number 1 there, and instead of black, let's do blue, or maybe green. And try that out. See? So it's fun to play around with and try different things. It says to uncomment out uncomment the timer lines to highlight where the code runs. So there's a couple of lines right here it's talking about. Oops, we want to leave the comment in. And see what it's talking about. Very interesting. So it says, every frame we wait for scanline 255 and then run the game code before looping back around. The code is run outside of the visible display area so that we don't update display registers while drawing and cause screen tearing. Okay, so that's chapter 6. It's a very interesting introduction. And now we're gonna move on to the next chapter. So we just kind of go up here, go to chapter 7. And in chapter 7, this is where we create our stellar spaceship. And he mentions on page 39 to try creating your own spaceship sprites. Let's run that, this demo. And what's neat about this one is if you have a joystick attached and plugged in to port 2, you can move it back and forth and up and down. You can only go up so far, and you can only go left or right so far. So it has checks for that. And pushing the fire button right now doesn't do anything. So that's this chapter, and then on page 41 it recommends try changing the player frame to your created sprite number. So if you built your own sprite, change it to your sprite. It says also toggle the sprite multicolor with true or false. And then sprite color information is set in code, not exported. So let's look at that, gameplayer.asm, and then where it defines the sprites right here on the init. Let's at least do the multicolor test. Let's do false. Oops. Okay, now it's not multicolor. That's interesting. Let's undo that. Wow, very interesting. So let's go on to chapter 8. So it kind of moves quickly like this, and you can, each program, he expands upon all the source code gets expanded slightly, and all new stuff is added into each one. And then you're introduced into the sprite editor here, and you can set up your animation. If there was an animation, you can set up animation, you can go through all your sprites. But right now we only have 2 sprites, and using the sprite editor you can go in and tweak that. In chapter 8 we go on, it's about shooting bullets. So let's take a look at that. And run it just to see what it does. So I can move up and down. Now I'm going to press the fire button. So now we have, you can fire bullets. And you can hold the fire button and it auto fires. Very cool, right? Very cool. So there's a good discussion in this chapter on how he accomplishes that, and using custom characters, starting on page 48, how you use the custom character set. And you can go in and redefine your own characters by going into the character editor. But what he did was redefined a few characters. Looks like starting at index 64. Right here, that you kind of redefine these. Moving on to chapter 9, we start bringing in aliens. We define a few more sprites for alien characters. Kind of loop through them in the sprite editor. And explosions. This is an explosion. And you can set the animation here, starting at sprite 5 through, looks like 5 through 16. So that's what the explosion looks like. So chapter 9 is all about adding aliens. Let's run it. That's cool, right? And can they, yeah, see, they hit you, and then so there's collision detection. You can shoot them as well. There's no sound. And so it's also a small chapter. He recommends try changing the alien movements, offset values on page 55. So that's right here. Move X array. So if we play around with these values, we can adjust that. Moving left and right. And then this really cool thing here that he talks about on page 55 also is this tools data generator, which I never really used this before, but you can plug in formulas and it will give you values on the right side. So if you plug in a function up here, this can be used to plot, let's say you want the aliens to move in a cosine fashion or a sine fashion. This will create that array for you. Moving on to chapter 10. Chapter 10 is about setting up the background Starfield simulation. It's done slightly different from what I could tell, slightly different than the way we did it on, or the way that Jay Aldred did it on his Galencia game, but same concept. And let's run that and let's see what we get with the Starfield simulation. So now, isn't that cool? So now you have, those look like single pixels, and they're multicolor or different colors in the backgrounds. And then you can go in, and he suggests on page 63, try changing the stars X or the stars Y positions, and you can also adjust the speed and color of the stars. Oops. Right here. So here's the color array, and here's their Y positions. Chapter 11, he goes into sound, creating the sound effects. So let's run that before we go into it. See what sound effects were added to the game. Let me turn that up a little. So you have a sound for firing, sound for dying, and a sound for destroying the enemy. Oh, the same sound, I guess, for dying is destroying the enemy. That's really cool. So it goes in a little bit of a discussion on the SID chip. And then on page 66 it says, try creating and playing your own sound execute buffers. So you can kind of tweak the code to try to jazz up the sound to your liking. Moving on to chapter 12. It's now that we've gotten this far, we need to try to turn this into a game. Because right now all you have is you're shooting back and forth, but it's not really a game yet. You know, you don't have score or you don't have lives or anything yet. So that's what this chapter is starting to implement. So now it says, now you have the text on the screen, and you have a score, your lives, and your high score. Okay, so there. So now you actually have a game, and it discusses the game flow starting in page 67. And you can, on 71, it suggests, page 71, it suggests try changing the string contents and the color. So let's look at game flow. So here's where the text is for the information on the screen there. It says the string must have a 0 byte at the end. Must have a 0 byte at the end. Interesting, interesting. Yeah, interesting. I mean, yeah, so you could say instead of press fire to start, you could say press the joystick button to start or something like that. It stresses on page 72 that the top row doesn't need to be drawn every frame because it's just the score. It only has to be updated when there's a scoring change. And then that's pretty much, that's the first game. The next chapter 13, you start going into making the platformer. And let's look at that while we're at it. We're almost through the whole book. And let's run that. This is neat because it's basically just like how we started the shooter. Now, instead of a ship, we have a guy who we can move left and right. We can't move, oh, we can jump also. We can't move up and down by pushing up or down. You have to push the fire button to jump. And then when he jumps, he spreads his legs. Woo! You can jump, oh, you can do two kinds of jumps. A little hop and then a real jump. And you get the taller jump by holding down the fire button. And so that's the very first intro to the platformer, your player animation. And it discusses the jumping movements on page 81. And then on the very next, moving on to chapter 14, we dive right into, let's add a scrolling background. So if you've never added a scrolling background to a game, this is the chapter you want to read. Let's check it out. Oh wow. No sound yet, but you can jump. You're blocked by the letters on the screen. Your sprite is actually in the foreground and there's characters behind you. And then when you jump, you can actually move in the direction you want to jump and you can land on top of those big letters. And when you go far enough, it actually scrolls. And you notice up at the top, the clouds scroll independent of the characters at the bottom. And that is because when you're scrolling on page 86, a maximum of 8 rows per frame can be scrolled using the code presented here to maintain 60 frames a second. This has been segregated into 2 rows for the clouds and 6 rows for the environment. Therefore, all other rows must remain empty. So that's why you have a lot of blue skies in the middle. So there's a good explanation in this chapter on how that scrolling is implemented. It's very interesting. And then on page 90, that he suggests going in and trying on gameplayer.asm and just try adjusting the minimum and maximum scroll thresholds here. You can try playing around with these. And then it goes on to talking about how collisions are implemented. Chapter 15, it's entitled Pick Up the Pickups. So we're adding more features into the program. In chapter 15, we can actually pick up things. Let's see what we can do. See, when we hit the flowers, we're picking them up. No sound yet. It says try placing the pickups at different locations on page 96. So there's a new subroutine added called Game Pickups. And then within that subroutine, there's a one called Game Pickups Handle. And here it's basically saying you can try placing pickups at different locations, and collision points are set up to collide with map row 6. Moving on to chapter 16. Dig up those pesky worms. So worms are one of the enemies that they introduced into the game, and they're an animated enemy. So let's take a look and see what it looks like. You see the worms going back and forth? And then when we hit one, okay, right now it's not doing anything when we hit the worm. But you can notice that their head, you can see their eyes. And we can take a look at the sprites for those under the sprite editor. There they are. So they have a different set for going left and for going right. So it's really just a 2-frame animation. Very effective though. And it says on page 100 to try on the game enemies subroutine, try changing the enemy positions and their movement values. And there's only 7 enemy sprites available, and plus 1 for the player. It makes that. So you can say it's just saying try tweaking those values on page 100 and 101. And then on the final chapter in the book, or at least for the programming part, in chapter 17 it talks about going from here and turning this what we've done so far into a platforming game. So let's see what it does. Oh, that's cool. So the score, the time, and your high score is at the bottom, and press fire to start. Now we have sound. Let's see if I die. Oh, I dematerialized when I died. Very cool. I'm not very good at this game. Try to make it to the end. Oh, very cool. So that's the end of the book. Well, that's the end of all the chapters they have on the programming, and then the book goes on to talk about how to switch it from here to running it on physical hardware rather than running it in emulation. And there's a good description on different types of devices you can use to accomplish that. And then at the end of the book, it talks about advanced topics and some additional resources to help wrap things up. And then he says that he would like to thank the following for their knowledgeable feedback. Jay Aldred, the creator of Galencia, at Galencia, www.galencia.games. and Graham Axton, creator of the Bear Essentials for the Commodore 64, over at pawnsoft.uk/bear.html. And then for extensive feedback and tool support, Arthur Jordison, creator of the CBM Prg Studio. And then for the amazing cover design and artistic input, Rick Nath and Andy Jackson at surface3d.co.uk. So that's the whole book in a nutshell. It's very interesting. Like I said, the most interesting thing to do is to go in, read the book to get the background, and then go in and tweak the program that you can download over at retrogamedev.com, and you can have a ball. You can have a blast playing around with this, and then maybe even tweak these programs and come up with something original and just have a good time learning how to program at the same time, maybe making your own thing too. So like I said, this is a great little book for beginning programmers, for people who are interested in programming or who actually have written programs but never have done these types of programs for the Commodore 64. I want to thank Derek Morris for sending this book and giving me the opportunity to share this with everyone on the channel. And go check it out. It's available over on Amazon.com. It's very reasonably priced, and you can download the source code for the book over at retrogamedev.com. And yeah, it's definitely worth your while, and it's a trip. It's fun playing with the source code and learning how a professional programmer will actually get something done, and the tips and tricks that you can learn along the way.